The debris field had no name on any current star chart. It was a silent desert of cold iron, where frozen metal plating drifted across light years like gray ice. Commander Wren stood on the primary bridge deck, his hands locked tight behind his back as he watched the mechanical sensor sweeps. The long glass screen in front of him flickered with green grid lines, tracking the slow tumble of broken bulkheads from a war that should have been forgotten. A small sensor light on the lower console began to blink a dull, uneven amber. It was a frequency that had been retired after the Asheville War 41 years ago. The old military channel was flat, dead, and legally closed, but the scanner was picking up a rhythmic pulse. "The signal is repeating," Solis said, her large dark eyes widening as she leaned over the communications board. She was a Draki technician, and her feathers flattened tight against her neck as she bit her lower lip to quiet her movements. "It is using an old encryption pattern. It shouldn't be active anywhere in this sector." Wren did not move. He kept his eyes on the blinking console, noticing a strange detail on the screen. The signal was not a broadcast from a stationary salvage beacon or a drifting black box. The transmission was moving at 3 knots, shifting slightly against the solar drift as if something was pushing through the junk pile. "Identify the code," Wren said, his voice flat and steady. Solis tapped the keys, her fingers making a sharp click against the plastic. "The database is pulling an old file. It says the carrier frequency belongs to a Titan-class siege carrier. The vessel name is logged as the UNDF Relentless." Orvad, the Pelosi historian sitting in the corner chair, let his digital tablet slide onto his knees. His pale face went even whiter in the iron light. "That is impossible. The Relentless was logged as totally destroyed during the final day of combat operations at the corridor border. 4 million tons of steel do not just reappear after 41 years. The amber pulse grew louder, turning into a low, mechanical hum through the bridge speakers. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound that matched the slow throb of an ancient sublight engine. "It is coming through the main cluster," Solis whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she checked the incoming audio stream. "A direct vocal transmission. It is rough, but the channel is open." A voice came through the static. It was weathered, hollow, and thick, with the raspy breath of an old man who had spent decades breathing recycled air. "This is the siege carrier Relentless," the voice said, "calling any regional command post. We have crossed the outer rim. Our weapons are cold. Is the war over?" Wren leaned forward, his knuckles turning white against the edge of the console. The voice did not sound like an automated trick or a pirate ghost signal. It was too tired, too heavy with real time. "Would you have stayed, or would you have run, because she didn't run?" The transition from the graveyard space to the active patrol deck felt like a cold drop. Commander Wren watched the radar lines reset, his mind tracing the sudden gap between the ancient history books and the physical metal currently drifting into his view. 41 years ago, the Central Fleet had signed the paper that stopped the guns, but nobody had told the ship out in the dark. "We are tracking a mass signature," Brest said, his large Tahari frame shifting as he cracked his wrist joints. The tactical operator pointed a thick finger at the center display. "Mass class is 4 million tons. The silhouette matches the historical records perfectly. It is a Titan." Out through the thick viewports, the shadow began to take shape. The debris field parted slowly, pieces of shattered scrap sliding off a prow that looked like a long iron cliff. Every line of its hull said the same thing without words: "I was built for one reason." It was covered in deep craters from old plasma fire, its gray paint scoured away by decades of micrometeorite dust until nothing remained but bare, dark titanium. "They are not changing course," Solis reported, her voice dropping into the quick, high register that showed her stress. "They are heading straight toward the human sovereign border line. If they keep this speed, they will trip the automated defense grids at the treaty boundary in less than 3 hours." "Can we jam their drive?" Admiral Ferris asked, his voice cutting through the bridge from the secondary command seat. He had just arrived from the lower decks, his dark uniform immaculate, the copper insignia on his collar catching the glare of the warning lights. His skin scales were rigid, his unblinking gaze fixed on the tactical slate in his hand. Under Post-War Code Section 12, any unregistered military asset entering a treaty zone without pre-clearance is classified as a hostile threat. "We have a duty to halt them." "They are a human crew, Admiral," Wren said, not turning around. "Their radio says they have been traveling from the outer darkness." "The records say they died 41 years ago," Ferris replied, his finger tapping a red combat flag on his screen. "We do not base fleet security on old radio voices. If that ship crosses the line, the automated defense grid will fire 48 heavy torpedoes within 10 seconds. It will be an automated execution." Wren looked back at the screen, where the red dot of the Relentless was crawling toward the bright green line of the treaty border. The space between them was shrinking. "Establish a live visual link," Wren ordered. "Let me see the face of the man who is flying that mountain." The screen flickered through 3 layers of old military encryption before the picture stabilized. The bridge of the Relentless was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of emergency dials and cathode ray tubes. Sitting in the high command chair was an old man wearing a frayed uniform with missing buttons. His hair was a thin shock of white, and his skin was lined with the deep creases of age and heavy gravity. "This is Commander Wren of the Regional Peacekeeping Patrol," Wren said into the pickup. "You are approaching a restricted treaty boundary. Identify yourself and your operational authority." The old man on the screen blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the light of the link. He lifted a hand that trembled with a slight, persistent palsy. "I am Captain Dale. We have no operational authority. Our command structure was closed when the spatial disruption array threw us 11,000 light-years into the unmapped sector. We have been burning our core for 43 years to find the way back." The bridge of the patrol ship went perfectly silent. Even Ferris stopped tapping his slate. 43 years, Orvad, the Pelosi historian, muttered from the back. He began checking his old personnel registries. The disruption event happened 2 years before the ceasefire. The ship has been missing for 43 years. The crew would have been teenagers when they left. "We held an annual vote," Captain Dale said on the screen, his voice steadying as he looked at Wren. "Every year near the mess deck corridor we counted the hands. We voted on whether to keep the engines hot or let the air go cold. For 42 years, the vote was unanimous to keep moving. We wanted to see the dirt again." "Captain," Wren said, his voice dropping an octave, "the world you left is gone. The United Nations Defense Force was dissolved 4 decades ago. The territory you are entering is governed by a joint council. Your ship is legally defined as a rogue weapon." Dale did not look angry. He looked down at his wrinkled hands, then back up at the camera. "The guns on this ship have been cold since the day we crossed the fold. We have no shells left anyway. The youngest person on my crew is 54 years old. We are not soldiers looking for a foreign war, Commander. We are just old people who want to die where the sun is yellow." "They must halt for inspection," Ferris stated, his voice loud enough to carry through the audio link. "If they refuse to cut their engines before the treaty line, I will order the patrol group to disable their drive sections manually. We cannot allow an unverified Titan-class reactor into a civilian sector." Captain Dale looked directly at Ferris through the monitor. "If we cut our main core now, the cooling valves will freeze within 5 minutes. They have been running at maximum pressure since before your uniform was tailored, Admiral. If we stop, we stay in this junk pile forever." Wren looked at the tactical map. Open loops were multiplying across his display as regional defense substations began to query the patrol ship about the massive signature. The automated grid was already warming its capacitors. the power draw visible as a yellow spike on the perimeter monitors. "I will not block them," Wren said to Ferris. "Then you are violating your operational codes," Ferris remarked, his posture stiffening as his gray skin scales darkened. "The law does not make exceptions for old stories." "We will conduct an underway inspection," Wren said, turning to his crew. "Prepare a boarding shuttle. I will go across to the Relentless myself. If the ship is unarmed and the crew is civilian by status, we can register them as a humanitarian passage before they hit the grid." "That ship has a 4-million-ton hull," Brest warned, his Tahari eyes narrowing. "Their interior internal air pressure is likely unstable. The atmospheric seal might fail the moment our docking tube locks onto their hatch." "Then we will wear hard suits," Wren said. He glanced at the monitor where Captain Dale was watching him with a quiet, waiting expression. "Keep your course, Captain. We are coming aboard." The patrol shuttle detached from the peacekeeper vessel with a sharp hiss of pneumatic thrusters. Wren sat in the front seat, his eyes fixed on the massive wall of iron growing outside the small transport window. Up close, the Relentless looked less like a ship and more like an island that had been beaten by stones for half a century. The shuttle crept toward the primary starboard airlock, its automated landing lights reflecting off the thick rows of rivets and industrial welding lines that modern shipbuilders had long abandoned. The docking ring engaged with a heavy, metallic clang that vibrated through Wren's boots. "Pressure is normalizing," Solis reported through the comms link from the patrol bridge. "But the gas mixture inside is strange. It has an extraordinarily high nitrogen count, and the oxygen is thin. It is going to feel like breathing on a high mountain." Wren cracked his helmet seal, taking a cautious breath. The air smelled of burnt oil, ancient soil beds, and the sharp mineral bite of iron-filtered grease. It was the scent of a machine that had been sealed shut during the previous age of the galaxy. He stepped through the hatch, his boots clicking on raw steel plates that had been worn smooth by 43 years of leather soles. Standing inside the airlock corridor was a small group of old men and women. They did not have military posture. Their clothes were a mix of old service wool and hand-mended insulation rags. They stared at Wren's clean white uniform with a distant, curious reverence, as if he had just stepped out of a historical painting. "Welcome back to the line, Commander," a woman said. She was leaning on a copper pipe that she used as a cane, her eyes clear and unblinking behind thick glass lenses. "We've been looking at your stars for 3 weeks. They're in the wrong place, but they look good." Wren gestured for the woman to lead the way. He walked close behind her, his eyes scanning the corridor walls. The steel panels were dark, covered in a thin glaze of grease from decades of machinery breathing through the ventilation ducts. Every few meters, the gray paint was broken by hand-painted shapes. Someone had used thick brushstrokes to draw fields of green grass, small square houses, and rivers that bent around hills under blue skies. "The children did most of the painting," the woman said, her voice dry as she shuffled along the deck. She did not look back. "We had 3 generations born between the stars. The ones who started this trip are mostly down in the lower holds now, under the floor plates. We had to melt the old refrigeration lockers to make room for them." The hallway opened into a massive central mess deck. The room was wide, lit by the flickering orange glow of exposed status bulbs that hung from bundles of black wire. Along the far wall ran a long, solid plate of structural steel. It was the inscription wall. Wren stopped. He walked to the edge of the metal sheet, his fingers brushing the surface. The entire length of the wall was covered in tiny, manually etched text. Thousands of names were scratched into the iron, arranged in neat, tight rows that stretched from the ceiling down to the deck plates. Beside each name was a service branch or a roll, followed by a date that stopped before the piece was signed back in the core. "We keep the ledger here," the woman said, tapping her copper pipe against the base of the steel. "It runs the full length of our survival. If someone stops breathing, the family takes a file or an old nail and adds the line. My name is near the middle. I was born 3 months after the fold. Ren ran his thumb over a row of characters. The metal was cool, but the edges of the scratches were still clean. He looked at the vast scale of the names, realizing how many people had lived and died inside a 4 million-ton cage without ever seeing a sky that wasn't projected on a screen. "Commander," Solis's voice broke through his earpiece, her tone sharp with renewed panic. "The perimeter sensors are tracking a shift from the border line. The automated defense grid just initialized its secondary power bank. The capacitor levels are climbing." Ren tapped his comlink. "Admiral Ferris, this is Ren. I am on the central deck." The crew is entirely non-combatant. The vessel is acting as a generational transport. Hold the automated activation commands. "The automation is outside my hand, Commander," Ferris's voice came back, cold and clipped through the static. "The regional station tracking your coordinates has already registered the ship's profile as an unhandshaked siege platform. The treaty logic requires an encrypted clearance token from the old UN command. If that carrier does not broadcast the validation sequence before it hits the coordinate marker, the grid fires. We cannot turn off the system from the bridge." "Then find a bypass," Ren said, his voice tightening. "There is no bypass for a core directive," Ferris replied. "The people who built that grid wanted to ensure no rogue Titan could slip through during a command collapse. You have 22 minutes before the physical threshold crossing. Tell the captain to drop his speed or clear the sector." Ren turned back to the woman with the cane. "Where is Captain Dale? I need to get to the bridge now." They moved through a narrow access trunk that climbed through the ship's spine. The air grew thinner here, carrying the faint, sweet smell of rotting vegetables from the ancient hydroponic trays that fed the crew. Every engine vibration felt heavier, a deep shudder that started in the soles of Ren's boots and rattled his teeth. The primary bridge deck was a low-ceilinged vault filled with the smell of warm vacuum tubes and old solder. Captain Dale sat in the center seat, his trembling hands gripping the armrests as he stared through the thick glass viewports. The stars outside were clean, but ahead of them, a series of red warning lights began to blink along the hull of a distant regional sensor platform. "The grid is waking up," Dale said, not looking up as Ren entered. "We can feel the targeting sweeps hitting our skin. It feels like static electricity on the hull." "Captain, your ship is going to trip the automated defenses," Ren said, stepping to the side of the command chair. "The modern fleet cannot drop the grid without an old validation token. Do you have the old command codes in your data core?" Dale let out a dry, rattling laugh. "The spatial disruption fried our secondary logic arrays 40 years ago. We are flying this mountain on magnetic tape and manual hydraulic levers. The code drives are nothing but rust." Ren looked at the tactical map on his handheld slate. The distance to the green line was less than 12 kilometers. At their current speed, the transition was a matter of minutes. "We can try to slave your steering thrusters to our shuttle," Ren suggested, his mind racing through the options. "If we pull your bow 20 degrees north, we can parallel the border line until we find a sector with a delayed grid response." "The steering lines are frozen, son," an old engineer said from a lower console. He was wearing an oil-stained wool coat, his hands covered in scars from old steam line leaks. "We broke the starboard valve 3 winters ago. We've been tracking on a straight line since we crossed the old nebula. If we try to turn her now, the frame will snap." "Then we have to stop the ship," Ren said, looking directly at Dale. "I told you," Dale replied, his white hair catching the orange glow of a terminal. "If the main core drops below 5,000 cycles, the cooling jacket collapses. The radioactive salt will freeze inside the pipes. The ship becomes a dead tomb before the sun hits the glass." The bridge speakers began to hiss with an automated siren from the external tracking post. It was a 3-tone pulse, the universal signal for a weapon lock. Warning, a flat, computerized voice broadcasted over the open regional channel. Target profile identified as UN siege asset. Validation sequence missing. Weapons engagement in 9 minutes. Behind him, Ren heard the soft sound of a door sliding open. Orvad, the Pelosi historian, stepped onto the bridge, his digital tablet held tight against his chest. His large eyes wandered across the ancient manual dials and the banks of analog switches. "Commander," Orvad whispered, his voice shaking, "I have been checking the historical operational logs for the Asheville sector. The Relentless wasn't just a siege carrier. It was the lead ship of the 3rd Vanguard. It carried the primary sector coordination relay." Ren turned. "What does that mean for the grid?" "It means this ship didn't just receive orders," Orvad said, his finger tapping the tablet screen. "Before the fold, this ship was the order. The automated grid stations along this line were deployed during the 2nd phase of the war. They were programmed to follow the command transmitter on this exact hull." "But the transmitter is dead," Ren said. "The arrays are scoured." "The primary transmitter is dead," Orvad agreed, pointing up at the low ceiling plates above the captain's chair. "But the emergency mechanical broadcast box is a separate unit. It sits in the belly of the keel, below the water tanks. It doesn't use digital logic. It uses a physical iron punch card that rotates through a brass reader." Ren looked back at the tactical screen. The time marker was down to 7 minutes. "Can we find the box?" Ren asked. "The box is down in the 7th sub-tier," the old engineer said, standing up with a heavy iron wrench in his hand. "But that deck has been flooded with dead reactor coolant since the year we lost the starboard turbine. No one has gone down there since the kids were small." "We have hard suits," Ren stated, his voice dropping into the quiet authority of an officer who had made his decision. "Show me the hatch." The descent into the lower spine of the Relentless was a journey through an iron graveyard. The lighting disappeared entirely, replaced by the narrow white beams of Ren's shoulder lamps. The air here was freezing, and thin frost lined the rivets of the bulkheads. They reached the door to the 7th sub-tier. The hatch was a massive wheel lock, sealed shut with thick layers of dried grease and red corrosion. Ren grabbed the wheel, his hardsuit gloves slipping against the frozen metal. "Help me," Ren said through the comms. The old engineer leaned his weight against the iron wrench, locking the teeth into the wheel's spoke. Together, they threw their shoulders against the bar. The metal groaned, a long, screaming screech of iron against iron that echoed down the empty corridor like an animal's cry. The lock turned 2 inches. Then, with a sudden, violent snap, the grease seal broke. A stream of black, bitter liquid began to pour from the bottom of the seam, freezing into dark ice the moment it hit the floor plates. "The water is coming from the cooling jackets," the engineer warned, his breath pluming in the cold light. "The box is at the end of the line, past the main tank. If the level is above the walkway, your suits will be touching the raw salt residue." Ren did not wait. He pulled the hatch open, stepping into a narrow crawlspace where the ceiling was low enough to force him onto his knees. The white beam of his light cut through a thick mist of vaporized oil, reflecting off the dark surface of a stagnant pool that filled the bottom of the deck. 5 minutes, Solis' voice called from the shuttle link. "The border station has opened its outer launch tubes. The torpedo sensors are locking on your position." Ren crawled forward, his knees splashing through the cold, greasy water. Every movement felt sluggish, his hard suit dragging against the narrow iron frame of the ribs. Ahead of him, a small brass housing emerged from the dark, bolted directly to the ship's main structural keel. It was the mechanical transmitter. He reached the box. The brass was green with age, covered in a thick crust of mineral salt. Through the small glass window on the front, he could see a massive iron disc filled with thousands of tiny, drilled holes. It was the command card. The lever is rusted shut, Wren reported, his fingers straining against a heavy copper handle on the side of the housing. The metal did not budge. Hit it, the engineer shouted from the hatch. It's naval brass, it won't spark. Wren lifted his right fist, his reinforced gauntlet catching the light. He brought it down against the copper handle with a dull, heavy thud. The lever vibrated but stayed locked. He struck it a second time, the impact sending a sharp shock through his arm. The brass gave way with a metallic click. Inside the housing, a series of old springs began to unwind with a slow, grinding whir. The iron disc shuddered, turned 3 degrees and stopped. "Is it broadcasting?" Wren asked, his eyes fixed on the small glass window. "The signal is moving," Solis reported, her voice rising across the link. "But it's rough. The regional station isn't dropping its lock. It's reading the frequency as an unverified echo." On the bridge monitor above, the green border line was close enough to see the individual defensive nodes. The red dot of the Relentless touched the outer boundary of the marker. Then the speaker on Wren's shoulder crackled. A new voice came through, not from the patrol ship and not from the old carrier. It was a cold, mechanical voice that sounded like it had been recorded 40 years ago and stored in a vault. "Command signal recognized," the border station broadcasted. "3rd Vanguard flagship identified, realigning regional defense parameters. Stand by for verification." The automated lock sirens did not stop. They changed pitch, turning into a low, continuous drone that meant the system was deciding whether to execute the target or clear the path. "Commander," Solis whispered, her breath catching, "the station isn't dropping the torpedo tubes. It's waiting for something else. There's a second lock initializing from the deep core." Wren sat in the dark crawlspace, the greasy water rising to his chest as the old ship groaned against the threshold. The loop remained wide open, the dark space outside the viewports waiting for the ink of an ancient law to choose between life and fire. The steel hull of the carrier shuddered as the secondary command lock flashed on the perimeter screens. Deep inside the automated defense station, another logic loop had opened. It was a secondary execution protocol, triggered not by the ship's ancient identification plate, but by the modern patrol vessel drifting outside the corridor. "Commander," Solis's voice was a frantic crackle in Wren's earpiece. "The secondary lock isn't coming from the grid. Admiral Ferris has slaved our patrol ship's forward missile banks to the boundary tracking station. He is bypassing our manual bridge controls from his secondary seat." Wren wiped a streak of greasy coolant from his face visor, his boots splashing through the dark water as he scrambled back toward the main vertical access ladder. "Ferris, drop the slave link. The grid recognized the flagship relay." "The relay is an unverified echo, Wren," Ferris's voice came back through the main channel, perfectly smooth and entirely without emotion. "The Central Fleet signed the peace treaty with a living council, not a machine that has been floating through dead space. A 4-million-ton hull with a functional reactor crossing into a civilian sector without a modern security signature is an illegal asset. If you will not fire, the automation will do it for us." "The crew is civilian," Wren shouted, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he climbed through the iron ribs of the 7th sub-tier. "They have 3 generations of children on the mess deck." "Then they are citizens of a state that no longer exists," Ferris replied. "They have no standing under current sector law. I am enforcing the boundary." Wren reached the upper deck trunk, his hands slamming against the hydraulic emergency door. The iron was freezing to the touch, and the thin air inside the corridor made his lungs burn with a sharp, dry heat. The stakes had broken through the personal safety of his boarding party. If Ferris fired, the explosion would tear through the thin hull of the carrier, igniting the old reactor core and scouring the entire border sector with radioactive fire. He burst onto the bridge deck. Orvad was still standing by the manual display boards, his pale fingers gripping the edge of his digital tablet so hard the plastic was bending. Captain Dale had not moved from his seat, but his eyes were turned away from the glass viewports. He was looking at a small, framed piece of paper that was taped to the side of his steering console. It was an old railway ticket from a human city that had been bombed to white dust during the second year of the war. Wren stopped. The contrast between the cold mechanical sirens and the small square of yellow paper was absolute. He watched Dale reach out with a trembling finger, his thumb gently smoothing the frayed corner of the ticket before he turned back to the control levers. "We used to take the morning train to the yards," Dale said, his voice dropping into a quiet, conversational rhythm that ignored the red warning lights flashing across his face. "My brother and we had blue caps. The conductor would punch 2 holes in the center of the card." "Captain," Wren said, stepping to the console, "we have less than 3 miles before the threshold. Ferris has slaved our patrol guns to the border station. He is going to fire the moment your nose touches the line." Dale nodded slowly. He did not look at the tactical map. Instead, he reached down to a heavy, iron lever that sat beneath his right knee. It was painted a dull, industrial red, its surface scratched and covered in grease. It was the manual purge valve for the primary reactor cooling jacket, the very control the old engineer had warned would freeze the ship into a dead tomb if it was pulled before they reached a service station. "Commander," Dale said, his hand tightening on the red iron, "we've done 42 votes on this ship. Do you know what we asked every time?" Wren did not answer. "We didn't ask if we were going to win," Dale whispered, his unblinking gaze fixed on Wren's eyes. "We didn't ask if the company was still paying our wages. We asked if we still remembered what the dirt smelled like after it rained. That's all. We voted for the dirt." The old man pulled the lever. With a deafening mechanical roar, the primary steam lines along the ship's spine blew their valves. A massive cloud of white vapor erupted from the lower vents, turning the space outside the viewports into a blinding fog of frozen water and mineral salt. The carrier's speed did not drop. The weight of the 4-million-ton hull kept it sliding forward through the debris field like a thrown stone, but the thermal signature on the tracking screens went completely dark within 3 seconds. "The reactor is cold," Solis reported from the shuttle link, her voice falling into a sudden, stunned whisper. "The heat signature is gone. The border station is losing its targeting lock. The automated torpedoes are tracking a ghost." "He killed the core," Orvad said, his eyes wide as he watched the green indicators on his tablet drop to 0. "They are floating on pure inertia. They have no power left to run the life support panels." The bridge of the Relentless went dark. The orange status lights died, replaced by the faint, blue glow of the distant sun hitting the thick glass windows. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the thin, whistling sound of the remaining air cooling inside the ventilation tubes. Wren turned to the main monitor link, which was running on the shuttle's backup battery. The red dot of the carrier was still moving toward the green line of the treaty boundary. The distance was less than a single mile. "Admiral Ferris," Wren said into the comms, his voice perfectly level, "the ship is dead. The weapon asset you were tracking no longer has a functional core. If you fire now, you are executing an unpowered transport box filled with retired laborers." The line remained silent for 5 seconds. Then, Ferris's voice came through, but it was no longer coming from the patrol ship's bridge. The background noise was different. There was the sound of distant civilian radio chatter and the low hum of multiple sublight engines. "The regional tracking station has just registered a secondary gathering," Ferris said, his tone shifting into a tight defensive knot. "Commander, look out your port side window." Wren stepped to the glass. Through the white mist of the purged steam lines, a series of small, bright lights began to pierce the dark space. They were not military hulls. They were long, clumsy freighters, rusted ore carriers, and white passenger liners with civilian registries painted across their hulls in broad, yellow letters. 17 distinct vessels had slipped out of the nearby human sovereign sector, their engines hot as they moved into a loose, curved line along the opposite side of the treaty boundary. They had not been ordered to move by the Central Fleet Command. They were not carrying tactical slates or automated defense tokens. They were the people who lived on the border stations, the ones who had spent 40 years listening to the old war stories while they rebuilt the colony towns. "They are opening their cargo bays," Orvad said, his face pressed against the glass. "They are deploying their manual docking cables. They're going to catch her." The open loop had deepened. The automated grid was still live. Its capacitors hummed with the remaining charge, but the civilian fleet had placed itself directly between the torpedo nodes and the drifting carrier. The choice was no longer between a rogue weapon and a legal code. The choice was now between the law of the treaty and the physical bodies of 17 civilian crews who were waiting in the dark with their cables ready. The civilian vessels did not falter. Out through the frozen mist of the purged reactor, the lead freighter fired its first magnetic cable. The heavy iron line shot through the dark space, its magnetic teeth slamming against the carrier's scarred starboard hull with a deep, hollow thud that echoed straight through the bridge floor. A second line struck near the engine housing, then a third. The clumsy mining ships and ore haulers threw their sublight engines into full reverse. Their frameworks groaned under the sudden traction, their metal seams sparking against the vacuum as they tried to absorb the momentum of the 4-million-ton mountain. "They have us," the old engineer reported from his dark terminal, his voice cracking in the shadows. He was checking a manual pressure dial with a hand that had stopped shaking. "The drift is slowing. We are holding at 1 knot." Wren watched the border map through his handheld screen. The silhouette of the Relentless crossed the green line. The automated defense nodes did not flash red. The secondary missile banks on the modern patrol ship flickered, their tracking flags turning from bright amber back to a flat, neutral gray. Admiral Ferris did not issue an override. On the monitor, he slowly leaned back in his command chair, his hands sliding off the console. His skin scales remained dark, but his unblinking eyes simply watched the civilian fleet form a protective circle around the ancient ship. The legal framework had dissolved. The presence of 17 registered colony ships had transformed a rogue threat into a crowded humanitarian harbor. "The boundary station has cleared the channel," Solis whispered over the link. "The tubes are closing. The watch is over." Wren stepped away from the window. He looked back at Captain Dale, who was still sitting by the red iron purge handle. The old man's fingers had loosened, his hand dropping down to touch the small railway ticket taped to his console. "The air is getting cold," Dale noted, his white hair barely moving in the failing draft of the ventilation tubes. "But the light looks right." "We are transferring auxiliary power from the shuttle," Wren said, gesturing to Orvad. "Let's get the family down to the lower berths where the insulation is thicker." The crew of the Relentless did not hurry. They moved through the dark hallways with the slow, synchronized habits of people who had lived in the same corridors for 43 years. Wren walked with them, guiding an elderly couple past a hand-painted mural of an apple orchard. He returned to the central mess deck to check the structural seals. The orange status lamps were dead, but Inspector Cora stood by the inscription wall with a small pocket torch. The narrow white beam cut across the rows of carved metal, illuminating the thousands of manually etched characters that covered the iron plate from top to bottom. At the very bottom of the last column, a small boy was kneeling on the deck plates. He was about 9 years old, wearing a tunic made from a gray service blanket. In his hand, he held a short, sharpened iron bolt. He wasn't crying. He was using the heavy tip of the bolt to scratch a final name into the steel plate, working with steady, rhythmic strokes that made a faint clicking sound in the silent room. Ren knelt down beside him. He did not take the tool. He watched the boy finish the last letter of the name, then looked at the early action he had noticed when he first stepped aboard. The way the old woman had leaned on her copper pipe, the absolute quiet of the engineers, the steady rhythm of their breathing. The hidden layer had nothing to do with military codes or old secrets. The crew had survived because they had spent 40 years treating the 4-million-ton weapon as a single house where every soul was logged. The boy set the iron bolt down on the deck plates. He did not file it. He looked up at Ren with clear, unblinking eyes, then walked back toward the lower berths where his mother was waiting. "Is the record complete?" Chorus asked softly, turning her torch toward the wall. "It's complete," Ren replied. The patrol shuttle uncoupled from the carrier 3 hours later, leaving its auxiliary power lines hooked to the main transport bays. Through the window, Ren watched the civilian ships lead the great scarred relic deeper into the internal system coordinates. The freighters moved in a loose, protective line, their white and amber navigation lights reflecting off the bare titanium hull of the Vanguard ship. The Relentless looked smaller now against the backdrop of the colony moons, but its silhouette stayed dark and solid against the yellow sun. Inspector Chorus sat at the small metal desk in the shuttle's secondary cabin. She pulled a blank digital log toward her fingers hovering over the screen before she looked up at Ren, who was standing by the glass with his hands locked tight behind his back. "How do I file the report for the Central Registry?" she asked. "The legal codes don't have a category for this passage." Ren did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the fading signature of the carrier as it entered the atmosphere line of the first human settlement. "Write it accurately," Ren said, his voice flat and steady. "All of it, don't leave anything out." The ship moved into the shadow of the planet. The long iron prow caught the last reflection of the high-altitude light, a single streak of dull copper that stayed bright for a brief moment before the dark swallowed the metal completely. The screen in the cabin went silent. The green lines of the grid vanished from the tracking monitors, leaving only the clean, empty space of the inner rim. Across the desk, the digital log waited for the first line. The iron bolt remained on the mess deck floor, its sharpened tip gray with the metal dust of the wall.